Welcome to Outsider Information. I am your host, Brandon, and we are doing this on a Friday because we have labor data. Now, generally, these are the shorter form shorts, try to get them under 3 minutes, but we got a lot of information that we are going to be taking a peek at. So, we're doing this. We're doing a longer form. Now, drink of the episode, because we got to keep things consistent, is the tea of the month from the newsletter, May Flowers, and it is delightful. Generally, I do not do floral, fruity teas, but this one is soothing, calming. It tells a little bit of a story in a cup. It is not bright. It is robust, and that is why I made it. All right. Labor data. We have 4 months of what we have seen so far. So we are now in the month of May. So we have seen the first 4. We are in quarter 2. And my thought was that things were going to get much better, like they usually do in quarter 1, and they did not. So I was wrong, and I have to say that. But we're going to do a little bit of a dive into really the last 25 years to just kind of see where some of the parallels are. We're going to look at the current numbers that we have, and then we are going to close this thing out. It is important to acknowledge that these are all snapshots in history. What happened in the past should be something that you learn from in the future. We just don't really do an excellent job of that, which is why we are repeating some of the same mistakes. The video that I did in January was the December labor report, and I looked at all of 2025. Also put out a written version of just kind of what my analysis was. And I also looked at recessions throughout history, starting with the Great Depression, going up through the most recent, which was COVID. We are not in a recession, but the vibes certainly aren't good, and something very much feels off. If you want that January video, I will put the link in the description. And if you want that labor report, I can put that link in there as well. I'm going to be glancing back and forth. I got notes to my side because this one is pretty data heavy. But when I looked at the recessions over the last 100 years, they all ranged in terms of unemployment between 6 and 25%. I've got personal gripes with the unemployment rate. I don't think it tells the best story, but that metric we're going to use because I've got one at the end, me encouraging you to hang around for a bit, that I'm going to weave it in with specifically. So I'm going to crunch some numbers. Things are going to sound really familiar because, again, we in 2026 have not learned any lessons from the past. In the past 25 years, we have had 3 documented recessions, the dot-com bubble, the Great Recession, and then COVID. Those 3 range between 6 and 14% unemployment at their peak. Starting with the dot-com bubble in 2001. This was really the shortest one, from about March to November of 2001. It didn't just happen in that particular space. Now, why I bring this one up specifically is it's in the time window, but also this is the closest comparison that a lot of people in tech have to what is currently happening. Those who were working in tech in the 90s, early 2000s saw this, and that is what they are equating the current version of what we're seeing with AI to be coming. It's just, when is it going to hit, if it's going to hit, and then if it does hit, what is that going to look like? There was a buildup, though. From 1995 to about 2000, there was a lot of money spent and invested, pouring billions into startups who had .com in their names. So we're seeing that now. We're seeing a lot of companies and people overinvest into what they think AI is going to be. More on that in a second. Around 2000, the crash started to begin. Federal reserves in the U.S. raised their rates. Japan had a recession, and there was a realization that maybe this wasn't going to be as profitable as they thought. A lot of startups were just burning through money, and there was really no path towards profitability. Sound familiar? Because that is a lot of what we are seeing with AI. There was overexpansion. Again, we're seeing that too. Companies spent billions laying thousands of miles of fiber optic cables, betting on a massive surge in internet traffic that didn't really materialize. We're seeing that with the data centers. And then ultimately, when the crash hit, the industry was left with massive debt and a lot of unused capacity, leading to a lot of massive bankruptcies and a lot of stagnation in equipment spending. Now, the silver lining to that was it made things a lot easier with those cables being laid, when the internet became much more accessible and cheaper, all the service that we're using today, from the cloud, streaming, all that was laid, but there was a pretty hefty price to pay because a lot of people ate it back then. There was a boom in advertising and media, and it certainly changed the way that a lot of that functioned. Now, if you watch the Super Bowl this year, this previous one, you will probably notice that the majority of the commercials were either AI, GLP-1s, or prediction betting, which made a lot of people think, is this literally what's fueling our economy? Answer is probably yes, but back in the late 90s, because .coms were the primary source of growth, you had all the advertising spending going towards that. The Super Bowl ads in January 2000, I believe that was Rams Titans. That was one of the best Super Bowls of all time. Anyway, distracted. 17 .com companies purchased Super Bowl ads, and in the next couple of years, really only 3 did. So you see the shift, right? Traditional media outlets had to recalibrate because they were reliant on those massive marketing budgets, and when that money went away, it had to pivot towards more of a performance-based model rather than just pure brand awareness. The appetite for if kind of went away, and that led to more shrinkage, right? Professional services, the ecosystem that supported a lot of these startups, venture capitalism, accounting firms, they had to reinvent their risk models because they were sold a dream. So when the stock became worthless, firms faced massive revenue gaps. And again, we are seeing a lot of this right now. It's crazy. You would think that people would just look back to not that long ago. Many of us are in that 25-year range of when that was taking place. But we repeat history. And the crash led to the scrutiny of how banks really invested in companies, eventually contributing to a significant piece of legislation being passed, which tightened the regulations on corporate governance and financial disclosures. So there was that. But the thing we really lost was the joy, right? Because people decide to tighten up everything and say that we wanted things to look a little bit safer and make it so that it appeared that it was more functional. They got rid of all the color. Remember the playhouses from the 90s, McDonald's, Burger King, all the colorful pieces of Taco Bell. Wendy's had yellow cups. I know I'm just listing fast food places, but things were bright, they were colorful, they were geared towards being attractive to people's eyes. And everything just got more serious. Earth tones, fake stone finishes, everything got more square and blocky. Minimalism, it appeared more stable, sophisticated, and because people were cautious, that was how things shifted, and it robbed us of all the joy. Yeah. The stock market, it contributed to a broader economic downturn because it crashed. In the window of that, we also had the September 11th attacks, which disrupted the travel industry. There was an estimated in this window $5 trillion in market value erased. And again, there's a lot of parallels to what we're seeing in 2026 based off of just those examples in general, with how things are being disrupted, how people are just investing in things that they think are going to be cash cows. We just have to see. So not that long later, right? We had a couple of years of peace, 1995 to about 2003. Even though that was the recession itself was 2001, nothing happens just that quickly. It's a buildup, and then there's usually just a leveling off. So 95 to 03 is really that window. So we got 4 years of peace, 4 years of happiness. And then 2007 hit with the Great Recession, a bottom-up collapse rooted in the housing market and banking system. The tool belt recession is what it has been labeled because it hit a lot of people in construction. About 38% of people lost employment between 2006 and 2010. Again, cascading. It's not just the window, it's before and it's after. 2 million construction workers lost their jobs about. 3.8 million housing foreclosures as the housing bubble burst, leaving millions of homeowners underwater, meaning that they owed more on their house than it was worth. The auto industry nearly collapsed because of high fuel prices, a sudden lack of credit for car loans, and a sharp drop in consumer spending. GM and Chrysler filed for bankruptcy and required an $80 million federal bailout to prevent totally having to liquidate their stock. And lost a lot of jobs. The slump in car sales decimated the steel industry. Steel prices dropped by nearly 80% in late 2008 as the demand from automakers and builders had evaporated. So, who was the villain here? Tech was the villain in 2001. The big banks were the villains in 2008. And there were so many institutional failures as major investment banks had to collapse and other ones had to band together to essentially create shotgun marriages to survive what was going on. It created a credit freeze because banks couldn't trust each other's solvency. They stopped lending, which means that businesses, even healthy ones, couldn't get short-term loans to pay their employees or buy inventory. And it turned a housing crisis into a general economic freeze. So what does that look like today? We have retail and logistics dealing with an inventory glut as consumers saw first year over year decline. The pipeline, the global trade, all of it seemed to back up. We have shipping and freight issues now because of a manufactured crisis. There is a pivot in terms of what people value because they can't afford some of the things that they once had. They are shopping at more places where they feel like they can get a deal rather than just get the things that they want. What this created, though, back then, which is not what we are seeing now, is an education boom. So generally in a recession, which that was a true recession, education is one of the few industries that grows during a recession. And unemployment here, it peaked at 10%. And as the job market dried up, people decided that they were going to go back to school to wait out the storm or to learn new skills for when things were going to kind of rebound. Millions of people did this, and it led to a massive spike in student enrollment, but also a significant increase in student debt, which put a strain on that system as well. A lot of people are currently dealing with that. I am one of those dealing with that, although I did choose to do what I was doing for a specific reason. I am not bitter about it, but a lot of people went back to school in that time window to get graduate degrees, and they are now being buried by student debt because the interest rates are predatory, and the entire system is kind of holding that one up as well. So there is that piece. Now we get to COVID, right? So we get ourselves out of that. That's about a 2006 to 2010-ish 11 window. We get more peace. We now get to COVID. And this, at least with the workforce part, started around 2009 with the Great Resignation. And it kind of peaked itself during COVID where things hit at about a 14% unemployment rate. And I've got a conspiracy theory about what happened during COVID because the unemployment rate was not just because people were being laid off. It was because employees actually had a lot of options and a lot of choice because so many places were looking for work and people actually had leverage in the market, which created some favorable conditions for the worker. And I think that a lot of businesses colluded to make sure that never happened again. But that is not why you were here. In previous recessions, the services were usually the safe part of the economy while manufacturing suffered. That is what we have seen. In 2020, this was completely flipped on its head. Travel, leisure, and hospitality, they were decimated overnight. The lockdowns, employment in restaurants, hotels, and entertainment all fell by nearly 50%. Global air travel dropped by about 60% in 2020, and it didn't just hurt the airlines. It did have an impact on manufacturing because nobody were buying new planes. They were canceled, those orders, and people were just kind of waiting. Oil turned negative. The price turned negative for the first time in history, and it made the U.S. have to really consolidate what it had. We saw the supply chain glitches, which is kind of what we're seeing right now. A sudden surge in demand for home electronics because the factories were shut down, meant a shortage of chips. Automotive industry, we're still dealing with the increase in car prices because a lot of new cars sat on the lots for months, causing used car prices to skyrocket over 30%. And again, those prices haven't gone down. When prices like that go up, they don't go back down, and we are still feeling that one. Large processing plants became hotspots for the virus, which led to bottlenecks. Farmers had to euthanize livestock because there was no way to process them. Even as grocery store shelves sat empty, a lot of food and stuff was being wasted. We had things accelerate digitally with remote work and remote school. The Amazon effect. While non-essential brick and mortar stores were forced to close, a lot of places that did e-commerce They saw record-breaking profits. This created a massive labor shift, resulting in hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced from other industries to go back to the warehouses and to do delivery roles because there was a surge and people were paying and people had bills and obligations. You had industries get decimated. You had other industries hired to keep up with scale, which means they overhired, and it created a K-shaped economy. A K-shaped economy is where you've got a sector of it completely going up and another one going completely down. There is no balance, and it creates massive inequity, not just from the business side, but from the socioeconomic side. And again, that is where things have kind of pushed us into this particular moment. So now, where we are at, we actually have not recovered from that. Between the CARES Act and the supplement stimulus, instead of bailing out banks, they bailed out households, which was actually probably the right decision. It's just that the execution of it was so awful. The massive injection of liquidity contributed to the inflationary cycle that we are now seeing that existed beginning in 2021, really through 2024. And we just have not gotten back to a baseline that existed back in 2019. It didn't exist in the last couple of years. So everybody who was complaining about things being out of whack, blaming the previous administration, it started much like we've seen all of these start, with a series of really poor decisions that take years to recover from. We are still kind of within that window, right? That 1995 to 2003, that was 8. The 2006 to 2010 with the last one. We're really still in that kind of 7-year, 8-year window from 2019. We are now in 2026. And honestly, this one might last a little bit longer because of some of what we are dealing with. So we fast forward to now. What we're seeing now is some weird amalgamation of the last 3 recessions. We've got overinvestment, we've got supply chain issues, we've got a war, we've got industry disruption, we've got a cruise ship incubating a virus. My God, it is all coming together in a very weird way. So when I see the jobs numbers come out the way that they do, I am skeptical, not because of what the numbers say, but because it doesn't feel like it's matching the reality of what people are going through in comparison to those other times. And I have been racking my brain trying to figure out why and what. And I think I'm a little bit closer because there's another number, and we are getting to that in just a second, that might tell a better story. So what do we have here? We have numbers that are better than expected for the month of April, which, if that's your bar, that tells you that something is probably pretty off and people are just trying to put a positive spin on it, which they are. And that is always my issue with the jobs report. It's valuable information, but it's very broad. It does industry, it does sector, it doesn't do roles, it doesn't really talk about the pay of those roles. It's helpful data, even though I would say that in the last year plus, I have a lot of questions of what that data is really representing, given who's giving it to us, and it doesn't paint the full picture. So for the month of April, they added 115,000 jobs. Great. More than double of what was projected at 55,000, and the unemployment rate remains unchanged at 4.3. To me, that makes no sense because you saw in the last month, certainly a bunch of people lose their jobs, and for that to be the case doesn't really match up. Okay. 185,000 jobs in March. Healthcare sector is a major source of private growth. They're saying employers added 37,000 jobs last month, according to the BLS, and transportation and warehouse industries grew by 30,000 in April. All that's fine. Like, those are fine numbers, and I encourage you to look at those exactly as they are, as numbers, because none of it is helpful and it doesn't address the actual issue that we are seeing. So if we're going to look at the actual numbers, estimated, right? And this is from Challenger, Gray & Christmas, one of the consulting firms that has been feeding us some of the economic data we're getting. I do not like private economic data because somebody is paying for it, which means it is being spun in a way that you just don't know exactly what that is. But according to Challenger, Gray & Christmas, since January 2025, 1.5 million approximate layoffs. Estimated jobs added, 539,000. Now, nobody's really talking about the former. Everyone's talking about the latter. And depending on who you're talking to, you are getting a wide variety of responses. 539,000 jobs added in essentially a year and a half. That really isn't all that good. And given the broad metrics and the numbers of it, it tells a worse story. But you're going to hear people say that this is relatively stable. About 6.9 to 7.1 million jobs remain open, which again, that's also not great. But employers are being cautious, right, about new headcount while restructuring teams, and this is part of the process. Well, okay, what's missing then? Because one, I look at that number and I see a minus 1 million deficit. I see a lot of people who have been laid off and a lot of people who can't find jobs because that number is out of whack. So that's one initial problem with it. When a household name like Meta cuts 8,000 people, so if they just fire 8,000 people, which they absolutely have in the last couple of months, it makes headlines. But the argument is, well, we don't see who's doing hiring, right? What if 4,000 dental offices each hire one receptionist, right? That's that covers the gap. No, it doesn't cover the gap. Even if they hired 8,000 receptionists, it doesn't cover the gap. That is not a net zero because those 8,000 people who got cut from Meta likely wouldn't be a, a suitable receptionist at a dentist office. We're adding jobs in industries that aren't in the industries where a lot of people are losing their jobs. So if you're adding jobs in healthcare and you've got a bunch of people in tech losing their jobs, you can't just transfer that over. You see how difficult it is with some of these job descriptions, which are awful, a lot of them. But the numbers are distorted because it takes time for some of these layoffs to also hit the system too. If you get a bunch of people laid off in March, they could still be on payroll through June, right? There could be a buyout negotiated. There could be a gradual period. This hasn't all hit, right? And when you're getting rid of that many people, the announced layoffs, all it's saying is intent, but those people are still out of a job, and it doesn't necessarily show in what we are seeing with something like an unemployment rate. So when I see 4.3%, it doesn't really track for me because the better metric actually is the labor participation rate, which, unlike the unemployment rate, which looks at people who are looking for work, the participation rate compares the total labor force to everyone of working age. So that excludes the people who are in the military, the prison, or long-term facilities. It is the employed plus the unemployed divided by the civilian non-institutional population times 100. So the unemployment rate, again, it looks at people who are unemployed but looking for work. That's a terrible metric because if you are looking for work, that can potentially buffer it. The labor participation rate looks at everything else. And the labor participation rate is currently at 61.8%, which is down from 62% a couple of months ago in February. There's the gap, right? So a labor participation rate at 61.8%, that's what? 39.2 or 38.2% of people. There's a 38.2% non-participation rate. I think that math is right. And it's been trending down for 25 years since the early 2000s, where it peaked at around 67.3%. So when this was kind of at its height, right, we had a lot of people as they got a little bit older exit the workforce. And we now find ourselves with what we have is essentially a missing workers dynamic. When people stop looking for work because they are discouraged pursuing education or they just exit the workforce in general, the unemployment rate might drop, but the participation rate will also fall, signaling that the labor market might be weaker than it looks. So those numbers matter. And if labor participation continues to fall, which it has, we start to get to the root of the issue. The question is why, and what is that ultimately going to look like, and what are the demographics within those specific numbers as it relates to labor participation? That is where we are going to have to go next because we got to figure out a way out of this. And that's going to be a different podcast episode that I am working on. I promise I will not go a month between doing it. But what this is going to look like probably is some version of a New Deal, a 21st century version of a New Deal. An FDR type is how we are going to get out of it. It is not a stimulus package. It is not what we did during COVID to basically create inflation. It is going to have to be a real structured plan to not just create jobs, but to ease the strain on the broader economy. So that is what that's going to look like. Not a whole lot of positivity with the numbers, unfortunately, but the good news is that recessions are generally temporary, and hopefully this gives a little bit of context and explains a little bit of what we're seeing. It is still technically not a recession. I don't know if we're ever going to hear that word out of this administration, but it definitely feels like it, and it feels like it's about to be. So when it does hit, we're going to probably just have to commit to a real rebuild to ensure a better future, and that is honestly the reality of it all. So um, yeesh, that's a long time, 25 minutes. Anyway, like, subscribe, engage. Can't save the world, but doing my best not to make it worse. I'll probably do a short on this as well, just to kind of try to say what it's going to be about. And yeah, we will jump back into things next week. Stay safe, stay sane. Get you in the next one.